and really started to think about what was the cost of staying versus the cost of leaving. So, I was super focused for a long time on the cost of leaving, like giving up the identity of being an executive at a large organization and the benefits and the paycheck and the bonus and the relationships. And when I started to think about what's the cost of staying, my mental health, time with family, relationships, working in something that I felt passionate about, that all of a sudden started to really outweigh the cost of leaving. And so I really took my courage from that and from my husband, who was super supportive, when he just one day asked, like, what's the worst that could happen? And I'm like, well, the worst that could happen is I go back to corporate America. And so we just had a lot of talks, and through that was able to decide I was going to leave.
Alrighty, it is time to stop hitting snooze and awaken to a life worth being, the fun and inspiring podcast that dives deep into what makes life truly fulfilling. I'm your host, Sue Willoughby, a self-proclaimed badass transformational life coach for women over 40. Join me as I explore the extraordinary journeys of ordinary people who've transformed their lives from the inside out. Tune in weekly to uncover the secrets to smashing through your perceived limits and creating a life that's not just well lived, but totally worth being. Welcome back to another episode of A Life Worth Being. I am your host, Sue Willoughby, and today's guest is the incredible Kristen Chimack. How did I do, Kristen? Did I get it right?
You did pretty good. You got it right.
Chimack,
Yep.
Like Chicago.
Yes.
All right. Chimack. And Kristen is a former Fortune 50 executive who traded the corporate grind for a life of purpose, authenticity, and bold self-discovery. After 30 years in high-powered roles, Kristen walked away from a six-figure job to answer the call for something more. Now, through her coaching company, Down to Earth Insights, and her wildly relatable newsletter, Kicking It with Kristen, she helps others break free from the outdated definitions of success and thrive on their own terms. Get ready for a conversation of truth bombs, inspiration, and permission to choose yourself loudly and proudly. Kristen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and for this conversation. I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
Oh, yes. I can't wait to unpack all of this stuff about leaving corporate America. I did the exact same thing. I walked away from a six-figure career and just, yeah. So let's kick it off. Tell me a little bit about yourself and, what gave you the inspiration to walk away from a 30-year lucrative career?
Yeah, I think I actually thought I was crazy at the time. And I think people thought I was crazy too when you do that. But, I'd been in corporate America for 30 years. It was all at the same organization, which is kind of a rarity. Mm-hmm. And it was the company my dad had worked at as well. So that organization had been a part of my life since as long as I can remember. And everything that's happened in my life, I really, can attribute to somehow to that organization. It was great when it was great. And then when it wasn't so great, it wasn't so great. And I'd been there from a payment clerk part-time when I was in college, and then left when I was an executive running their public relations department. And the last 4 or 5 years, I just found myself, probably even last 10 years, found myself in the situation of driving into work thinking, gosh, there has to be more. I want to do other things, and adjusting my retirement timeline earlier and earlier. And then the last 4 years, I couldn't ignore that whisper anymore. And I talk about the whispers a lot in my book that just came out, The Cost of Staying. But I got to the point where I just felt like, you know what, I have to make this change for myself and my well-being, and really started to think about what was the cost of staying versus the cost of leaving. So, I was super focused for a long time on the cost of leaving, like giving up the identity of being an executive at a large organization and the benefits and the paycheck and the bonus and the relationships. And when I started to think about what's the cost of staying, my mental health, time with family, relationships, working in something that I felt passionate about, that all of a sudden started to really outweigh the cost of leaving. And so I really took my courage from that and from my husband, who was super supportive, when he just one day asked, like, what's the worst that could happen? And I'm like, well, the worst that could happen is I go back to corporate America. And so we just had a lot of talks, and through that was able to decide I was going to leave, started my coaching business, and now I help others kind of find their authentic self and, decide whether they want to stay where they are or move on to something else. And then I also started the hotel sourcing business, which is super fun, helping people place their events in hotels.
Wow, that's a lot. Let me just put a timeline on this though. How long
Yeah.
ago did you decide to leave? When you like, okay, this is my exit date.
Yeah.
So how long
Yeah.
ago is that?
So my actual exit date was about 19 months ago.
Okay. Who's
I had
counting?
been, yeah, it's about 19 months ago. I had been thinking about leaving probably for a good 10 years, and then finally got up the courage that, yes, I was going to leave. And it still took me about 9 months after that to kind of work through just, everything that you need to think about, from the financial aspects of it to becoming comfortable with, like, what's everybody going to think when I go do this crazy thing. So yeah, it did take a bit of time to kind of work through all that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I know myself, I also left corporate America. Now, I was not at the same company for 30 years. I think I probably would not have lasted. And it's also hard these days, right? You jump around a lot. I was in tech,
Mhm,
so
mhm.
went from a lot of tech companies, and I was in technical training. So training department's always the first one to go. Like when things start to shift, they're like, well, they're always like, we need training, we need training, we need training. And then until we don't, and then we're going to blame the
Yeah,
training department and get rid of them. Like, oh, okay, great. Bye bye. I find
yeah,
myself that like with every tech company that was having a riff, reduction in force, for those of you
yes.
who aren't familiar with that term, um, I was like raising my hand, like, pick me, pick
I
me,
was like
pick,
that. Like, please let me, give
right?
me a deal. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take the package, whatever the package
Hmm.
is. Yeah, just get me out of here, and then
Yeah.
go on to the next adventure and the next adventure and the next adventure. So,
Hmm.
I I completely love that you talked about the cost of staying. We'll talk about your book a little bit. The cost of staying versus the cost of leaving, because I think people put too much focus on whether it's a relationship, whether it's
Hmm.
a job. I mean, it's applicable to so many different things.
Yeah.
Um, that you have to at some point say, why, what is it costing me to be here? And like you
Hmm.
said, physically, emotionally, just everything.
Yeah.
And I think people discount that a lot, that they think more about like, oh well, I'm gonna be living
Hmm.
out of a trash can, and I'm gonna, whatever. If we're talking about a job, could be a
Yeah.
relationship too. So what's the cost of staying? But tell
Hmm.
me a little bit more about what kinds of things went through your mind when you were, making your pros and cons list.
Yeah, I mean, the pros and cons list were quite interesting. When I was thinking about, like, staying, like, the cost of not leaving, it was, there was just so much of my childhood and who I was and who my family was that was wrapped up and connected to that organization. So, that was a big identity piece that was kind of hard to get past for a while. And then the expectations that everybody has, right? It was an organization that people started with and stayed with and retired with. And that was kind of the badge of honor, right? You stayed and you worked 35 years and retired. So there was a lot of that that went into kind of, I don't want to say the guilt of even thinking about leaving. And then the normal stuff, right? The salary, the bonus, the benefits, like all of those things really were easy cons to think about. But when it came down to, I just found myself every day like I was not in alignment with the organization anymore, right? The company over 30 years is changes, right? The culture changes, the environment changes. And so there were just things that I couldn't put my finger on it right away. Like, why do I feel so out of alignment? And so I did a lot of work and really got clear on my core values and not only what they were, but what did they mean to me? And that's when I started to, when I was doing that work, I started to see, a core value of transparency can mean different things to different people. For me, it was that, people were honest, that they did what they said they were going to do and some of those things. And I could just look at my everyday and see the disconnect there. And so I started to see in like my top 4 or 5 core values, 3 of them were completely out of alignment with the changes that had happened in the organization and the role that I had. And so that's when I started to have those aha moments of like, oh, this is why it's becoming so difficult to show up authentically. I was really good at being authentically who they wanted me to be and not authentically who I was. And once I started to realize that, I'm like, okay, the cost of staying is I'm not being true to myself. I'm in misalignment with my values every day. I'm not having fun. It's a horrible feeling. And, I'm having to like pry myself out of the car to go into the office. And then relationships at home weren't great, right? I was stressed. I was crabby. I wasn't able to show up at events with my nieces and nephews and friends. So it started to really become clear that it was time to move on. And that's how it ended up outweighing, all the pros of staying. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And good for you for doing the work. I think that people, I mean, that's some deep work that you did. That's hard
Mm-hmm.
stuff to look at. How is this really affecting me? And, I worked at a big corporation as well, with people like yourself that, stayed in those roles forever and ever and ever.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them did because they loved it. And that, and that's great. And then, there's people there that, don't love it. And
Yeah.
we still
Yeah.
call them retired in place, RIP, because that's how they present, right? And it's like, why
Yeah.
don't you just like leave? But they couldn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot to do that. Now,
Well, and I think
I
you have to admit that, you change over that 30 years. The company
sure
changes over that 30 years.
some people don't though.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But, you just have to, I had to get really real with myself. Like I thought this was the place that I was going to be.
Yeah,
And all of a sudden it's not. And that takes just a lot to process for sure. That's, I think that's why it took me, quite a while to actually really seriously consider leaving and then actually leaving.
yeah. Well, you did have some also family history there, like you said. Your
Yeah.
dad had worked at the company for his entire career and
Mm-hmm.
so forth. And um, what happened with your dad when you
Yeah.
told him, "Hey, this is this is not a match for me anymore"?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because my dad retired from there. My sister and her husband still work there. So, it was one of those when I finally made the decision and I'd actually had written the resignation letter. So I was done. I had decided. I thought I have to call my dad. And I was probably more nervous about that call than any call.
Right?
But I called him. And of course he had known that, the company had gone through changes, that it wasn't the same place it was when he
Yeah.
was there. But his answer surprised me, and that he said, it's about time. Like, go for it. And I'm like, oh, okay. I was so worried about like, how am I going to explain this? And what does he expect? And, I thought he was going to be shocked. But I think he had definitely had seen the toll that, at least the last 4 or 5 years had taken, both on me, just, mentally, physically, the stress level. So to my surprise, he was probably one of the most supportive of all.
That's funny because we do that a lot. I think we make stories up about how other people are going to react, and we just don't know. But we create, oh, my dad's going to have this tough time with it because he spent his entire career here and he
Yeah.
loved this company so much, blah, 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 blah. And then he's like, well, it's about time. Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Go
company has
for it.
changed so much. Get out while you still
Yeah.
can. So good for
Yeah.
him, and good for you for, putting yourself out there because, like I said, sometimes we worry more about how other people are going to react,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't really matter, right? It's not
No.
their life, it's not their business, it's not their career. So
Yeah.
that I think is a huge thing. And like I said, it's not just in business, but
Mm-hmm.
also in life and in relationships. And I mean,
Absolutely.
I've changed careers so many times when I was younger, especially. And then I was I found my niche, and that was in corporate training and technology, and loved it, and did that for many years.
Mhm.
But before that, I was always bouncing around. People were like, "Oh, what are you doing now?" I'm like,
Yeah.
"Business, it doesn't matter. I'm doing something different."
Yeah.
Even now, I still get that, like, "Oh, you're trying this new thing?" Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
trying
I
a new
am.
thing. Yeah, is
Yeah.
there something wrong with
It's
that?
uh it's been so interesting, people's responses, and when you mentioned that about, we put the other's expectations, and it really doesn't matter what they think.
Yeah.
One of the hardest things I think I faced after resigning was the reaction of people that I'd worked with for 30 years, some of them, and the silent ghosting that all of a sudden started to happen. I call it professional ghosting. That was super hard because,
Mm,
these were people who I'd been, close friends with, traveled with, knew their kids, all those things, right? After you spend that long someplace, who all of a sudden seemed to have lost my phone number, or wouldn't, even as so much as give me a thumbs up on a text. And so just, how people react, and then what comes over the course of the next year or 18 months. And some of those relationships come back, some of them don't.
mhm.
But that's the whole adjustment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting. And the first thing that kind of comes to my mind about that is, when you try and step away or try to do something different, and
Mhm.
you have a friend group or a work group or whatever, I think that some of it may come from, oh, she's leaving us, she's moving on, and we're still stuck here,
Yeah.
right? I don't know if that's true, but I think sometimes a lot of that is people don't want us to change. They don't want us to grow.
Mhm.
They want us to stay
Yeah.
as we are because it doesn't threaten them at all.
Yeah.
And you're threatening if you're moving on, you're leaving, you're doing something
Mhm.
fabulous. So, yeah, I totally get that. But
Yeah.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit, and I want to
Sure.
talk about, okay, we're out of corporate America. Let's not talk about that
Yeah.
anymore.
We're done with it. It's in the past.
It's
Yeah.
in the past. It's in the past. You decided to move forward. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing now and why you're so inspired by it.
Yeah. So, it's so funny. The things that I'm doing now, people would look at it on paper and say, well, those don't connect at all. But I knew when I left that whatever I did next, it needed to align with really who I am and what I love to do.
Mhm.
And I mentioned the values work, but I also really spent time thinking about, like, what did I love to do when I was 5? What did I love to do when I was 12? What did I love to do when I was, 25? And it all really, when I looked at all of those things, it came down to I love to help people and I love to organize things. So those were the two things. And so I started the coaching business to really help others who were, you know, mostly I help mostly women, but I do have some men that are clients, but really that are in that place of there has to be something more, or what else could there be, or how can I show up authentically at work? That's a lot of the work that I do in my coaching business. And then because I love organizing and part of my corporate career was in events, I decided to open up the Hotel Whisperer and do that work where I help companies and individuals place their events in hotels. And then on top of that, decided to write the book, because writing has always been something that I've really enjoyed. So, although three pretty distinct kind of things, I find even if I'm working more, I'm just always in sort of a flow state, which has been super amazing. And I find that I'm helping people on all of that work across the board. So it's just been really rewarding and fun. And, if something doesn't work, then I try something else. And
Good
so
for
it's been
you.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I want to know a little bit more about the Hotel Whisperer. Now, you talked about doing event planning,
Yeah.
and do you actually find the venues and help people create the events or plan the events or pull them off, or do you just connect them with venues?
Yeah. So what I
Curious.
do in that work is I really meet with them, kind of understand what they want their event to be. And
Mhm.
then I'll write up a request for proposal, research what properties potentially they would be able to fit their event, depending. Sometimes they'll give me countries they want to go to or specific cities. So I'll find the properties that would best work with their event. And then we'll reach out to those, get all the pricing back, and then we'll actually help them negotiate the contract.
Hmm.
And then once the contract's signed, I stay involved just to, send them reminders on contract due dates and those types of things. So yeah, so it's been super fun.
Cool. That's
Yeah.
interesting. I like that. Um, And then tell me about your book, because I'm really
Yeah.
curious, and we've touched on, the cost of staying versus the cost of
Hmm.
leaving. So tell me how the book came to be, clearly out of your experience.
Yeah.
And I think you said it launched last week, right?
April 1st. So
Wow.
this
Oh,
week it's very
no fool
new.
here.
Yeah, no, it's not an April Fool's joke. It's funny. April 1st has been a big date in my life. That's my wedding anniversary. Now my book launch date. So it's like a reoccurring
Perfect.
pattern. Yeah. Yeah. So the book is called The Cost of Staying. And it does pull a lot from my personal experiences, not just professionally, but I do talk about, friendships and relationships and, all of those different components. But it really speaks to that journey of being comfortable with and learning and having the courage to choose yourself, whether that's in, a relationship or a professional career, personal. And it walks through what I call the growth through grief spiral, and four distinct phases of that. So it's the whisper phase, which is really learning to recognize the physical signs your body's giving you that something's off. Because I'm a big believer in your body generally is signaling you well before your mind has caught up to what's happening. So it's all that, the whispers, and learning to recognize them and giving them space and, exploring what those mean. And then the second part of the spiral is letting go. And so once you sort of recognize something, learning what it is that you need to let go of so that you can move forward, which is the third part of the spiral's possibilities. And that's where you really get to kind of dream up like what could be next, or what does this mean, and how great things can be. And then integration. So then once you know all those things and you've worked through it, how do you put it all together to lead the most authentic life, and work within your passions and your values, and just be yourself.
That's great. I think people tend to, and I notice that with my clients as well,
Yeah.
they tend to want to skip right to the third part, like the dreaming
Yes.
phase and then the implementing phase. And it's like, well, you got to do a little bit more foundational work
Yeah.
before we move to that,
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise you're just jumping from, oh, I really want to, be a sommelier and go, or I really
Yeah.
want to do something, and it's like, okay, have you really thought about, what got you
Yeah.
to this point? So I think that people, I don't know, that's just my observation. I can
Mm-hmm.
tend to do that myself as well, but
Yeah.
not doing the work beforehand before you
Mm-hmm.
then actually go in. Are you, tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are around that?
No, I agree completely. Well, I mean, right, the possibilities phase is like the fun one. Like you
Yeah.
can dream up all these
Yeah.
great things and everything works out and it's all perfect.
Until it's
Yeah,
not.
until it's not. Yeah. And I tell people, like, that's why I call it the spiral, because it's not like a linear, you go through it and then you've arrived.
Yeah.
I often talk about it even in my entrepreneurial journey. I can decide something today and find myself all the way back in letting go. And so it's just a constant, anytime you're thinking about making a change or doing something different, there's usually something, almost, I can't ever think of a situation where there isn't. There's something you're going to have to let go of before you can move forward. And whether that's your identity or if something financial or a system that you have. And so I've just found that it's really easy when you walk through it that way to get people to slow down enough to recognize, okay, I can dream up this big thing and it sounds fabulous, but what do I have to let go of in the process, before I can really get there? But you're
Yeah.
right. People want to jump all the way to the end.
Of course, because it's
Yeah.
easier. We don't have to look at any of the other
Yeah.
stuff, other hurdles that we have to
Yeah.
overcome.
All the
And
hard stuff.
yeah, and I love it that you do call it a spiral, or it's got a life cycle of,
Hmm.
every little thing you're going to go through those iterations, right? You're going to go
Yeah.
through the discovery phase, the letting go phase, all of those. What was the first one? It's not really
Whispers. The
whispers,
whispers.
right?
Yeah.
Whispers. So
Yeah.
that's a little like discovery, right? Where you're
Yeah. Oh,
you're
yeah.
hearing these voices inside your head going,
Uh-huh.
"What do you think about this?" And
Yeah. Or like when you're in a conversation and you realize you're holding your breath, like every time you talk to someone, you're holding your breath with them. You're like, okay, that's probably not a really positive relationship. Or they call and every time you look down and you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to answer that. Like there's something in you that's telling you to pay attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny. I also teach pre-licensing real estate, and it's funny because I tell new real estate agents when you start a new career, especially in sales of any sort, you
Yeah.
think that you have to take every opportunity that comes knocking, every client, every
Yeah.
whatever. And I tell
Hmm.
people it's okay to say no. It's not
Hmm.
a good fit. It's okay.
Yeah.
Because if you do that and you dismiss one potential client, you're going to get a better one.
Yeah.
And otherwise, you're just going to, feel
Hmm.
desperate all the time. And then, like you said, when the phone rings and you look down, you're just like, oh my God, not this person, please. I don't want to deal with
Yeah.
them. Right.
Yeah.
You could have dismissed them and kept that space open,
Hmm.
but I think that it's hard for people to say no. Like, it's that
Hmm.
scarcity mindset, right? If I
Yeah.
don't take this opportunity, I'll never have another opportunity.
Hmm. It's so true. And even when I was starting my businesses early on, I had a client come in, really would have been a really big client, would have been a great commission on the hotel side. But you have that, it was the whispers. I had it like, this isn't going to be good. Like, this is going to be a lot of work, more than, what would be normal. And I did get to the point where I finally said, you know what? I left my corporate role to be able to be in control of this. And I want to do things that make me feel good and that I love what I'm doing and that I'm helping people. And I just don't see it happening with this client. So I referred them to someone else who is working through that with them. But it was a lot initially to think about letting that go, because I could see the possibilities of keeping them, but I could also see the possibilities of keeping them, if you know what I mean.
I absolutely do.
Yeah.
And there's a great series of books called The Go Giver. Have
Mhm.
you read
I
that at all?
haven't. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, and it talks about that. It talks about letting go of things and being able to open up that space for something better. It's
Yeah.
okay to not be a good fit. You can't be everything to every single person. And
Hmm.
that's really important reminder, I think, especially
Yeah.
in business, because if it's going to leave a bad taste in your mouth, if you feel like it's going to leave a bad taste in your mouth or it's not a good fit, then it's probably not going to be a good fit for them either. And you may not get a referral out of it, or you may not get
Exactly.
whatever out of it, because that energy is surrounding that relationship or that transaction or that
Hmm.
whatever. And you can't deny that negative juju, if there's any there, if
Yeah.
it's coming from you or if it's coming from them. So
Yeah.
is gonna come back to bite you. That's the way I look at it.
Agree. 100% agree.
So in your book,
Hmm.
do you give people some actionable tips and tricks or
Yeah.
steps to kind of go through the that your spiral?
Yeah. So the book is broken up into the 4 parts of the spiral.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's generally 3 chapters that talk about that particular phase of the spiral. And then the fourth chapter is exercises related to it. So, for instance, like in the whispers section, the exercises that then follow are around core values, kind of that authenticity check. So, where do you feel most authentically you? And if you don't, why not? And so there's a series of probably 3 to 5 exercises at the end of each of the spiral sections.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've also created that in a workbook that's on my website that people can download.
Perfect, perfect. So
Yeah.
that information would be in the book. So they buy the book, then they get the workbook for free, or well,
Yes. Yeah.
as a download, as an
As a download.
actionable thing. That's great. I
Yeah.
love that. I
Yeah.
love having a nice bundle for people to be able to tie things up, because when you're
Yeah.
presenting new topics, people have to work through them. And
Hmm.
it's otherwise, they have to have something tangible, I think, to help
Yeah.
them, put a pin in things, I think.
Yeah, and sometimes, right, it takes time to work through it, and
Absolutely.
versus just reading a book and you know everything. So a lot of the exercises are things like, for the next week or couple of weeks, write down every time you feel like something's bugging you, and where or where are you making excuses, and then what's keeping you from making a change, like what are you afraid of.
Hmm.
So it's things like that it takes time to kind of begin to recognize and listen to some of those things, especially if you're used to pushing them aside.
Exactly. And we all do that. We all do that.
Yes.
So I love that, it's kind of the first step. And I do the same thing when I work with clients and work, I'm an equus coach. So I use horses in my coaching practice,
Yeah.
and they're really good at helping you build that awareness, because if you're not aware that you're doing something, or if you are aware and you're pushing it aside, then you can't get beyond that. And
Yeah.
you have to start being aware, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
my God, I did this thing 25 times yesterday. So
Yeah.
it's like, having a swear jar.
Yeah.
Mine's full all the time, by the way. So,
Well, and I found, right, in my situation in particular, it had just become my normal,
yeah,
right? Like it had just become part of the normal day for years, that I would think, oh, I could do something outside of here, or I could make this into a business, or, so it became such a normal part of me and of conversations with my peers that were there, that you don't recognize, like, wait, that's not normal until you start to journal and sort of write it down.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as we're wrapping up here, I'd love for you to ask you, if someone is in that position that you were in, and they're only a year into some job, and they're like, I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
Before they get 30 years down the road, what would be your biggest piece of advice that you could tell somebody who's considering a major life change?
There's so much. Yeah, I mean, I think for a couple of things, I think, getting clear,
Mm-hmm.
and really taking the time to think through things. And for me, that involved getting a coach, right? It involved getting someone outside of the organization and outside of my, personal relationships, to be objective with me. And so just getting clear on who you are, what you want, why you're not, why you're feeling that way. So a coach really helped me there. And then I think finding a community. So, for me, having grown up in an organization for 30 years, my community was pretty rooted in that organization. And so I started to think about and dream about what would be next. But then I was also very deliberate about trying to find communities where people that were doing that already were, so that I could start to get just a very different perspective on, what it could be like. And then creating options, that was huge for me. Really sitting down and thinking about, okay, if we go down to, one salary in the household, or if I give up these benefits, or, and what are the different options and things that I can do to offset those, was super important. Is it I want to build something while I'm still working? Do I want to take a step back from the executive role, stay at the organization and build something? Do I just want to leave? And what are those options, and what does that look like? And then the big one is just, start taking action. Even if that action is just, thinking about someday I want to be a coach, once a week, go talk to someone who is a coach. But just starting to take action, it could be super small steps, so that you feel like you're moving forward. And then, one step leads to the next step, which leads to the next one. And it eventually will all kind of take shape, and you'll start to get even clearer on where you need to go.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. I love it. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
Kristen, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate your time and your energy and hearing more about your journey. And it's one that truly, rings true and resonates with me.
I bet. Yeah.
To get out there and just live your life, because if you stay stuck, you're going to stay stuck,
Yep.
and you need to, think about what really lights you up. So
Mm-hmm.
thank you for lighting up my audience today.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it. And like I say, you only get one life, so you might as well go live it.
Exactly. And it's never too late. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter.
Yeah.
Whenever you feel the urge, just follow your urges. So thank
Yes.
you everyone for your time today. If this show has resonated with you, one more thing.
Yeah.
Kristen, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm out there all the time. So just my name, Kristen Chimack. And then on my website, KristenChimack.com, you can find information about my coaching, my book, my hotel business, and the downloads we talked about.
Perfect. And I will put all that information in the show notes.
Awesome.
So If you were inspired today, please subscribe to the channel. I have a YouTube channel. Subscribe to the podcast. Please rate us, review the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. If there's some topics you'd like me to have on the show or a potential guest, let me know that too. And until then, please think about creating a life that's worth being. And I will see you next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode of A Life Worth Being. I hope you found it fun and inspiring. And to avoid a bad case of FOMO, please be sure to click that subscribe button. If you love what you heard today, please share it with a friend and then hop on over to your favorite podcast platform and return the love with a wonderful review and 5-star rating. It would truly mean the world to me. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and on my website. Links below in the show notes. I appreciate you, and I will see you next week for more fresh insights on awakening a life worth being.